So, React is a front-end and open-source JavaScript library which was useful in developing user interfaces, especially application with a single page. And it is also helpful in building complex and reusable UI components for mobile and app because it follows a component-based approach. And we have some awesome features of React, like it supports server-side rendering. It will make use of virtual DOM rather than the real DOM. Like I say, it follows a component-based architecture, and it also supports one-way data binding. So these are some features of React. Uh, so useState is a built-in React hook. With the help of that, you can use state variables in functional component as well. So a useState hook is useful when you want to render something on DOM dynamically. In useState, you have to pass the initial state, and it will be return an array which contains two elements. First is state variable, and second one is the function. With the help of that, uh, you can update the state variable. So this is useState. Key is a special string attribute that needs to be included when using list of elements. Basically, keys helps React to identify which elements were added, changed, or removed. And key should be given to an array elements for providing a unique identity to each element. And without keys, React does not understand the order or uniqueness of each element. And keys are generally used for displaying a list of data that coming from an API. So this is some importance of key. A virtual DOM is a concept where a virtual representation of the real DOM is kept inside the memory and is synced with the real DOM by a library such as React DOM. Why was virtual DOM introduced? DOM manipulation is an integral part of any web application, but the DOM manipulation is quite slow when compared to other operations in JavaScript. The efficiency of the application gets affected when several DOM manipulation are being done. Most JavaScript frameworks update the entire DOM even when a small part of DOM changes. For example, consider a list that is being rendered inside the DOM. If one of the item in the list changes, the entire list gets rendered again instead of just rendering the item that was changed or updated. This is called insufficient updating. To address the problem, to prevent the problem of insufficient updating, the React team introduced the concept of virtual DOM. So how does it works? For every DOM object, there is a corresponding virtual DOM object, basically copy of the real DOM, which has same properties. The main difference between the real DOM object and the virtual DOM object is that any changes in the virtual DOM object will not reflect on the screen directly. Consider the virtual DOM object is a blueprint of the real DOM object. Whenever JSX elements updated, the every virtual DOM object gets updated. Uh, React uses two virtual DOM to render the user interface. One of them is used to store the current state of the object, and other to store the previous state of the object. Whenever the virtual DOM gets updated, React compares the two virtual DOMs and get to know about which virtual DOM objects are updated. After knowing which object were updated, React renders only those objects inside the real DOM instead of rendering the complete real DOM. This way, with the use of virtual DOM, React solves the problem of insufficient updating. So this is virtual DOM. So the props in React are the inputs to the component of React. They can be single valued or object having set of values that will be passed to the component of React during creation. The naming convention of the props is almost look similar to the HTML tag attribute, and basically we can say that props are the data uh, passed from a parent component to child component. Basically, it is used to pass data from parent component to child component, and props are immutable. We cannot change props in our child component. First of all, they both are used to store the data. But the main difference between them is that prop is used to pass the data between components, that is from parent component to child component, and state is used to store the dynamic data in the component. And we cannot pass a state to other component without prop. And the second difference is that props is immutable and state is mutable. We can change state with the help of state function, but we cannot change the props in child component. And the third difference is that we can directly use props in both class-based as well as functional-based component. But in case of state, we can only use state in class component. React doesn't provide inbuilt state object in functional component. In order to use state in functional component, we must have to include use state hook. Every component in React has a built-in state object which contains all the property values that belong to that component. Basically, the state object controls the behavior of component. Any change in the property values of the state object leads to the re-rendering of that component. But a state object is not available in functional component, but we can use React hooks to add the state to a functional component. So sometime while developing React application, there is a need to pass data from a component that is high in the hierarchy to a component that is deeply nested. So to pass data between such component, we pass props from a source component and keep passing the props to the next component in the hierarchy till we reach the deeply nested component. So this is the prop drilling. And the disadvantage of prop drilling is like we passing the data to those components, they don't even record that data, but we still are passing the data into them. Error boundaries provide a way for us to catch errors that occurs in render phase. Any component which uses a lifecycle method a component did catch or get derived state from errors is considered as error boundaries. When we are not using the error boundary, instead of seeing an error, we see a blank page. Since an error inside the render method leads to unmounting of component. To display an error that occurs in the render method, we use error boundaries. So hooks are built in React function. With the help of that, you can use state and other lifecycle features in functional component as well. So React hooks cannot be used in class component. They let us write component without class. So React hooks were introduced in the 16.8 version of React. Previously, functional component were called stateless component, and only class component were used for state management and the lifecycle method. So the need to change a functional component to a class component whenever the state management or lifecycle methods were to be used led the development of hooks. So a React hook must be called only at the top level of the function of the component, and it is not allowed to call them inside the nested functions, loops, or conditions. And we can't call them in class component. We can call only them in functional component. So the use effect React hook is used for performing the side effects in the functional component. With the help of use effect, you will inform React that your component requires something to be done after rendering of the component or the after the state change. Basically, it takes two arguments. First is the callback function, and second one is the array of dependency. So the function you have passed will be remembered by the React and call afterward the performance of the DOM update is over. And using this, we can perform various calculations such as data fetching, setting up document title, and manipulating DOM directly, etc. So it don't target the output value. The use effect hook will run by default after the first render and also after the each update of the component. So React will guarantee that the DOM will be updated by the time when the effects are run by it. So earlier reps were only limited to a class component, but the now it can also be accessible in functional component through the user ref hook. Uh, The refs are used for managing focus, media playback, or text selection. It is also useful in integrating third party DOM libraries, and it is also useful in triggerative and imperative animation. So these are some use of refs. So a custom hook is a function in JavaScript whose names begins with the use and which calls other hooks. Basically, it is a part of React 16.8 hooks update, and it permits you for reusing stateful logic without any need of components hierarchy restructuring. In almost all the cases, custom hooks are considered as the replacing of the render props and HOCs and reducing the amount of nesting required. Custom hooks allow you for avoiding multiple layers of abstraction or wrapper hell that might come along with the render props and HOCs. And the disadvantage of custom hook is that it cannot be used inside the classes. So the strict mode is basically a tool that is added in version 16.3 version of React to highlight the potential problems in application. It performs additional checks on the application basically. The use of like a strict mode is identifying the custom component with unsafe lifecycle method. Like certain lifecycle methods are unsafe to use in asynchronous React applications. With the use of third-party libraries, it becomes difficult to ensure that certain lifecycle methods are not used. Strict mode helps in providing us with a warning if any of the class components uses the unsafe lifecycle method. A second thing is a warning about the uses of legacy string API. If one is using an older version of React, callback ref is a recommended way for manage refs instead of using the string refs. Strict mode gives a warning if we are using string refs to manage the refs. Warning about the uses of find DOM node. Previously, find DOM node function method was unsafe to search the tree of a DOM node. This method is now deprecated in React. Hence, this strict mode gives a warning about it. So these are some uses. So the reason for re-rendering in React is re-rendering of a component and its child component occur when the prop or state of the component has been changed, and re-rendering of such component that are not updated affects the performance of the application. So how to prevent re-rendering? So we will make use of if we are using class component, we will make use of the suit component update. So suit component update basically what it will be do to prevent re-rendering the chat, we will use suit component update. So as one can see the code above, the return false from the suit component update method which prevent the child component from re-rendering. So there are many different ways through which we can style a React component, but some of the ways are inline styling. So we can directly style an element using inline style attribute, but make sure the value of style is an JavaScript object. And second one is using JavaScript object. We can create a separate JavaScript object and set the desired style component, desired style property. This object can be used as a value and of the inline style attribute. Third way we have using creating separate CSS style sheet. So we can create a separate CSS file and write all the styles for the component inside that file. This file needs to be imported inside the our component file. And we have another way using CSS module. So we can create a separate CSS modules and import this module inside our component. And we can create this CSS. We can create a file with modules by using .module.css extension. Okay, so higher order components or HOC is a function or a component that takes another component as an input and returns a third component. But it's important to know that it's a pure function, so it doesn't modify the component that it receives as a parameter. Basically, it is useful for code reusability, And the most famous case of HOC is React Redux with Connect. But after the introduction of hooks, these higher order components are less used. Okay, so to improve the performance of your React app, there are a lot of techniques, but some of them is React.memo that memoize the entire component. But if you don't want to memoize an entire component, you can use memo or use callback that are hooks specially designed for improved performance because it stores the content that it passed to that it passed to it server rendering. It only renders when needed. So if you just declare a variable inside your component, it will reload every time it re-renders. But if you don't if you use memo, it doesn't same thing. It doesn't same thing with function. So you can have use callback. Another thing use we can also mention to improve the performance of React application is lazy loading, where we can load a component earlier like text, buttons, and some components later like images and variables. So to pass data from child component to parent component, first we create a callback in parent component which takes in the data needed as a parameter, and then pass this callback as a props to child component, then send the data from child component using the callback. So this is the way we can pass data from child component to parent component. So there are four different phases in the life cycle of React. So now first is initialization. During this phase, a React component will be prepared by setting up the default props and initial state for the upcoming top journey. Then we have a mounting phase. So mounting refers to the putting the element into the browser DOM. Since React uses virtual DOM, the entire browser DOM which has been currently rendered would not be refreshed. This phase include the lifecycle methods like component will mount and component did mount. And then we have updating phase. So in this phase, the a component will be updated when there is a change in the state or props of a component. This page will have lifecycle methods like a component will update, should component update, and render, and component did update. Then we have a unmounting phase. So this is the last phase of lifecycle component lifecycle. The component will be removed from the DOM or will be unmounted from the browser DOM. This phase will have only one lifecycle method, which is component will unmount. So we have a various lifecycle method. Like first is constructor. This method will be called when the component is initiated before anything has been done. It helps to set up the initial state and initial values. Then we have get derived state from update. So this method will be called just before the element rendering in the DOM. It helps to set up the state object depending on the initial props. The get derived state from props method will have the state as an argument, and it returns and it it returns uh, an object that made changes to the state. This will be the first method to be called as an updating of the component. Then we have render. So this method will output or re-render the HTML to the DOM with the new changes. The render method is an essential method, and we will be called always, while the remaining methods are optional and will be called only if they are defined. Then we have component did mount. So this method will be called after the rendering of the component. Using this method, you can run statements that need the component to be already kept in the DOM. Then we have should component update. So the boolean value will be returned by this method, which will specify whether React should proceed further with the rendering or not. The default value for this method will be true. And then we have get snapshot before update. So this method will provide access for props as well as for the state before the update. It is possible to check the previously present value before the update even after the update. Then we have component did update. So this method will be called after the component has been updated in the DOM. Then we have final step, we have component will unmount. So this will be called when the component removed from the DOM. So there are two types of hook, a built-in hook and custom hook. And built-in hook have other two types like basic hook and advanced hook. So basic hook contains use state, use effect, use context, and additional hooks contains use reducer, use memo, use callback, use imperative handle, use debug value, use ref, use layout effect, and custom hooks are the custom hooks is basically a function of JavaScript. The custom hook working is similar to the regular function. They use at the beginning of the custom hook name is required for React. So this is the custom hook. There are the React hooks. It is used in functional component of React, whereas classes are used in basically is used class-based component React. And React hook will not require a declaration of any kind of constructor, whereas classes required to declare a constructor inside the class component. So, and React hook does not require the use of this keyword in the state declaration or modification. And in classes, this keyword will be used in state declaration and in the modification. Like in state declaration, we use this dot state, and in modification, we use this dot set state. And then React hooks, it's easier to use because of use state functionality. And here no, and in classes no specific function is available for helping us to access the state and its corresponding. Then React hooks can be helpful in implementing Redux and context API. And in classes, because of long setup of state declaration, class states are generally not preferred. Get snapshot before update, get derived state from error, and component did catch. So these are the lifecycle method. We don't have hook for them. So a React router refers to a standard library used for routing in React. It permits us for building a single page web application in React with navigation without even refreshing the page when the user navigates. It also allows to change the browser URL and will keep the user interface in sync with the URL. A React router will make use of the component structure for calling the components using which appropriate information can be shown. Since React is a component-based framework, it is not necessary to include and use this package. Any any other compatible routing library would. So the major components of React router are like we have browser router. So it is a router implementation that will make use of the HTML5 history API. And for keeping your UI, it is useful for keeping your UI to be in sync with the URL. It is the parent component useful in storing all other components. Then inside browser router, we will make use of routes. So it is a newer component. It is introduced in version 6, and to upgrade the React component. Then we have basically inside the routes we will make use of route. It is considered to be a conditionally shown component, and some UI will be rendered by this whenever there is a match between its path and the current URL. And then we have a link, and this route component takes element as a parameter. And then we have a link. So it is useful in creating links to various routes and implementing navigation all over the application. It works similarly to the anchor tag in HTML. And route don't take parameter, it takes element as an as an props. Conditional rendering means that a dynamic output of user interface markups based on the condition state. It works in the same way as JavaScript conditions. Using conditional rendering, it is possible to toggle specific application functions, API data rendering, hide or show elements, and decide permissions level, authentication handling, and so on. So there are different approaches for implementing conditional rendering in React. Some of them are like using if-else conditional logic with the suitable for smaller as well as medium-sized applications. Then we have ternary operator, which takes away some amount of complication from if-else statements. And then we have using elements variable, which will be enable us to write cleaner code. Events are the triggered reactions to specific actions like a mouse hover, mouse click, key press, etc. But there are some syntactical difference like events are named using camel case instead of just using the lowercase, and events are passed as a function instead of strings. So NPM stands for Node Package Manager. It is a package manager for the JavaScript programming language, and it is the default package manager for the JavaScript runtime environment Node.js. It consists of command line client, also called npm, and an online database for public and paid for private packages called the npm registry. The registry is accessed via the client, and the available packages can be browsed and searched via the npm website. The package manager and the registry are managed by the npm. So a Node.js is an open source cross-platform JavaScript runtime environment that executes JavaScript code outside the browser. So a context allows passing data through the component tree without passing a prop down manually at every level. In React application, we pass data in a top-down approach via props. Sometimes it is inconvenient from certain types of props that are required by many components in the React application. Context provides a way to pass values between components without explicitly passing a props through every level of the component tree. So this is our context. So Redux versus context. So you can use context in your application directly, and is going to be a great for passing down data to deeply nested components, which what it was designed for. Whereas Redux is much more powerful and provides a large number of features that the context API doesn't provide. Also, React Redux uses context internally but doesn't expose this fact in the public API. So you should feel much safer using context via React Redux than directly, because it changes the burden of updating the code will be on React Redux instead of developer responsibility. So a code splitting is a feature supported by bundlers like Webpack, Rollup, and Browserify, which can create a multiple bundles that can be dynamically loaded at runtime. The most React app will have their files bundled using tools like Webpack, Rollup, or Browserify. Bundling is a process of following imported files and merging them into a single file. A bundle This bundle can then be included on a web page to load an entire app at once. A React.lazy is the recommended solution for code splitting. It uses Suspense and it is maintained by React. A suspense in code splitting is a generic way for components to suspend rendering while they load data from a cache. It is a fundamentally new capability that lets you render a component tree in background while components are fetching data, and display them only after the whole tree is ready. Pure functions are called pure because they do not attempt to change their inputs and always return a same result for the same inputs. React is pretty flexible, but it has a single strict rule that all the React component must act like a pure function with respect to their props. So components are the building blocks of any React application, and a single app usually consists of multiple components. A component is essentially a piece of the user interface. It splits the user interface into independent reusable parts that can be processed um, separate. There are two types of components in React: stateful components, class component, and functional component. So Flux is an application architecture that Facebook uses for building web applications. It is a method of handling complex data inside a client-side application and manages how data flows in a React application. There is a single source of data, and triggering a certain actions is the only way to update them. The actions call the dispatcher, and then the store is triggered and update their own data accordingly. When the dispatch has been triggered and the store updates, it will emit the change event that views can change rendered accordingly. Redux versus Flux. So Redux is an open source JavaScript library used to manage the application state, and the store of Redux, the state of the store is immutable, and Redux can only have a single store, and it uses a concept of reducer, whereas Flux is an architecture and not a framework or a library, and the store of state is mutable in Flux, and Flux can have more than one store, and it uses a concept of dispatcher. So a synthetic event is an object which acts as a cross-browser wrapper around the browser's native event. Basically, it combines the behavior of different browser native event into one API, including stop propagation and prevent default. And basically, uh, we define it using E or event. So this is web browsers cannot read JSX directly. This is because web browsers are built to read the regular JavaScript objects only, and JSX is not a regular JavaScript object. But if you want a web browser to read a JSX file, you must have to transform the file into regular JavaScript object with the help of transpilers like a Babel. So element versus component. So an element is a plain JavaScript object which describes the component state and DOM node and its desired properties. Whereas component is the core building block of React application. It is a class or a function which accepts an input and returns a React element. It element only holds information about the component types, its properties, and the child elements inside it, whereas component can contain state and props and has access to the React lifecycle methods. Element is immutable, whereas component is mutable. Uh, Element cannot apply any method. uh, we cannot apply any method to elements, and in components we can apply method on the components, and yeah, that's it. Fragments are faster and consume less memory because it did not create an extra DOM node. Some CSS styling like CSS grid and flexbox have a special parent-child relationship, and uh, addition of div tags in the middle, which makes it hard to keep the desired layout, and the DOM inspector is less cluttered. So the Create React app is a tool introduced by Facebook to build a React application. It provides you to create a single React application. The Create React app are pre-configured, which saves you some tree consuming setup and configuration like Webpack or Babel. You need to run a single command to create, and this command includes everything which we need to build a React app. Some of them are given below. It includes React, JSX, ESX, and Flow syntax support. It includes auto-preferred CSS. So you don't need to WebKit or other prefixes. It includes the fast interactive unit test runner with built-in support of coverage and reporting. It includes a live development server that warns about the common mistakes, and it includes a build script to bundle JS, CSS, and images for production with hashes and source maps. So in uncontrolled component, the data of the form elements like input and text area field is handled by our DOM or refs. And in control component, this data of their form elements is handled by React state. So control component does not maintain its internal state, whereas uncontrolled component maintain its internal state. And in control component, data is controlled by the parent component, and in uncontrolled component, data is controlled by the DOM itself. And in control component, it accepts its current value as a props, and in uncontrolled component, it use uncontrolled component uses as a ref for their current values. And control component allows validation control, but uh, uncontrolled component does not allow validation control. And control component has better control over the form elements and data, and uncontrolled component has limited control over the form elements and data. So virtual DOM is a lightweight JavaScript object which is an in-memory representation of real DOM, and it is an intermediary step between the render function being called and the displaying of elements on the screen. It is similar to the node tree, which lists the elements, their attributes and contents as objects and their properties. The render function creates a node tree of the React components, and then update this node tree in response to the mutations in data model caused by the various action done by the user or by the system. So virtual DOM is a lightweight JavaScript object basically. A virtual DOM works in a three step. Whenever any data changes in the React app, the entire UI is rendered in virtual DOM representation. Now the difference between the previous virtual DOM and the new DOM is calculated. And once calculations are completed, the real DOM updated only with those things which are actually changed. So this is how virtual DOM works. Redux is the open source JavaScript library used for state management, and basically it is a predictable state container for applications using JavaScript, and it is based on the Flux design pattern, and Redux is very small in size. So this is Redux. So in Redux architecture, actions are nothing but the plain JavaScript object which contains a type field and a payload field. They can be thought as an event that is used to describe something which has happened in the applications. Actions contain only a tiny bit of information that is required to maintain what has happened. So, constants in Redux help us to easily finding all the uses of a particular functionality across our entire project when we are using an enlarged development environment. Using constants, we can avoid the silly bugs caused because of typing errors or typos, as it shows when a reference error whenever a typo is made. So reducers are the pure functions that take a previous state and action as an a parameter and returns a next state. A store is used to carry together all the states, reducers, and actions which create in the app. Some of the responsibility of user stores is like the state of the current application from inside is held by the Redux store. We can access the current state using store.getState, and we can update the state using store.dispatch, or we can say actions, and we can also register listener callback using the store.subscriber or listeners, and methods of store is like a get state, subscribe, dispatch, replace reducers. So using Redux Thunk middleware, we can write action creators returning a function instead of an action. This thunk can postpone the dispatch of an action or do conditional dispatchment. The arguments passed to the inner functions are the store methods dispatch and getState. In the event of an action creator returning a function, the function gets executed by the Redux Thunk middleware, and it does not have to be pure. In other words, in other words, in other. Thunks are standard approach for writing async logic in a Redux app. A thunks returns a function instead of a plain object, and because thunks returns a function, you are able to do things inside of that function, like make API calls, and then use the result of those calls to update your Redux store. Or second definition, a thunks are standard middleware that you use for mm, creating ha- creating and handling side effects in Redux app. We can so what are the things which we should never do inside the reducer? So the things which we should never do inside the reducer is as follows: modify the arguments of the reducer. We should assure that we do not perform any side operations such as routing, transitions, API calls, and we should not call non-pure functions, for instance date.now method, mat.random, etc. Yes, if you have like a feedback in what area I can improve myself, so I will be able to create like it will be helpful for me.